I believe we're on. Welcome, Science Sunday lovers. Thanks for coming in. We've got a few folks here and hopefully people at home, so thanks a lot. Another session of Science Sunday. We wanted to talk this week about brain development. I wanted to discuss that especially in young children, and ask Carrie Friedman to co-present. She's concerning arts and young children is a big topic. When you can get a person knowledgeable and this is her field, you ask them to do it, and I'm looking forward to hearing it. We didn't really emphasize any cohesion in what we talked about, so I just gave her the free rein to discuss this, her aspect of artistic development and development in young children, and I'm excited to hear her thoughts. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more, maybe the science, what they've been determining lately is going on in young children's minds, even before they're born. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Carrie to discuss Dr. Friedman, right, to discuss her topic. And thanks a lot, Carrie, for doing this.
Thank you for coming, those of you who are in the audience. That makes it easier. I'm Dr. Carrie Friedman. I'm a professor of art and design education at Northern Illinois University. That's just to give me some cred talking about this stuff. So I'm talking about artistic development today, and there's so much to talk about in terms of artistic development, and I only have about 15 minutes that I decided to slice off a piece to talk about having to do with the stages of artistic development. But there's a huge amount of information about artistic development. People have been studying this topic since about 1900, when folks started collecting large numbers of children's drawings and analyzing them. And before then, it wasn't really an issue or a research question, because people generally thought children were just imperfect adults. So around 1900, researchers started thinking, there might be something there that we can look at, and there was quite a bit there to look at, apparently. So now, new brain research has been particularly helpful in understanding artistic development. For example, we know now that when people look at and make art at any age level, it releases dopamine. So this is why people like art, partly because, it makes you actually feel good. And making art lights up the reward systems in your brain. So that's another important attraction to the visual arts, particularly in childhood. So basically, the theory goes, based on that brain research, that if your child is having some problems, put them in front of some art materials and let them make art. That'll make them feel better, and it does often. So
what if they paint on the walls?
I'm going to talk about that.
Okay.
So that's normal. All right. So because there's so much to talk about in artistic development, it would take a whole Science Sunday and more, because I teach a class that has a lot to do with artistic development, so I talk about it often during a semester. I decided just to cut this little piece out and talk about this, because these are the two questions parents ask me the most. Why is my child doing this? And is it normal? So this is why I'm going to show you that. So in terms of viewing development and drawing development are very different in terms of brain development. Viewing development follows pretty close to regular cognitive development. And so you see stages, if you like to call it that, we do in education because stages help us to design curriculum. But in fact, stages are very blurred, and often students who are, let's say, going through something traumatic will move into an earlier stage. So these stages are not cut and dried by any means, but we use them for scientific investigation and for educational practice. So for viewing development, as I said, we see categories that fall very neatly into general cognitive development. So for example, with little ones from approximately 4 to 7, and again, these ages are approximate, we see general characteristics like the kids are eye-focused, They use very concrete language, they're learning language, so they tend to focus on concrete words. They're very communicative, so they focus on those. And they have a kind of family sense of time. They understand that their mother's older than them, their grandmother's older than their mother, but that's about it. Then in the middle level, from about 7 to 13, we see the kids become very we-focused. Any parent knows this. They start having strong oppositions. So if you've ever driven in a car with a 7th grader and rolled through a stop sign, you'll hear about it. That was the wrong thing to do. So they're learning about the rules. They want to know the adult rules so they can break them sometimes, but they're very focused on these kind of strong oppositions. And they have a daily life sense of time. For the older students, the students basically in high school, they have a strong sense of community. They're building their community. They can use abstract language, and they have a historical sense of time. So even though when we teach, we use historical works of art at every grade level, we don't actually teach the history of art, the history of Western art, the history of Asian art, and so on, until high school, where we expect them to know artist names and dates and so on. So this is, in each of these categories, you get comments from students that you might expect based on these particular developmental characteristics. So for instance, the early group will tell you, for example, that animals can make art because they saw in a picture book that a tiger can paint with its tail. And then in the middle group, you'll hear things like, and by the way, the early group loves abstract art because for them, color and subject are the most important things in a work of art. The middle group doesn't like abstract art anymore. They're very much about strong oppositions. They want to learn how to draw realistically, and something that's not realistic is not good, and this is why very often at this age group, children will not want to do art anymore. They'll kind of resist art. And unfortunately, this is when schools think it's okay, because of that resistance, to give up art. So very often you won't have art required in a school district after about 7th grade. And so you will have many, many, many adults who end up drawing at a 5th to 7th grade level for the rest of their life, because that's when their education stops. We are hardwired to draw, but drawing well, drawing realistically, takes training. That's all it takes. You don't have to be a talented person to draw realistically. That's just a technical skill. Anyone can learn it. I could teach anyone to draw realistically. I have made that promise, and I will stick to it because I've done it many times. And then for the later group, the high school group, which I'm actually not talking about today in terms of their artwork, we'll see a much more relativistic approach to art, so those kids appreciate abstract art again, and so on. They're more open-minded about it. All right, so what I'm really going to focus mostly on today is graphic development, because again, I'm just slicing up a piece of the pie for the time. So we're going to look at some kids' artwork. I'm talking about three general stages of artwork. Manipulative stage is the first one. This is about approximately 2 to 5-year-old. I've taught kids who are 7 who were never given art materials by their parents, who were still in this stage. So in this stage, you see these three things. Space goes beyond the page. They use arbitrary color. I'm going to show you examples of these. And they use lever and circular motions and marks. So here you go, Scott.
There's a masterpiece.
All right, so the first thing that kids like to do, and the first thing we want them to do, we hope that they'll do, is to learn they can make a mark on the world. That's one of the many, many important things that art teaches children, that they can actually influence the world. They can make a mark, and people will look at it and ask, what is that? And sometimes parents will look at it and say, on the wall, not so much. Here's a piece of paper, and they will go through the process of learning how to stay on the paper. So they do start out with space beyond the page because they haven't learned the adult requirement of staying on the paper. They're really, at that age, everyone's a mural maker. They also use arbitrary color, meaning, they may choose the color that's closest to them or the color that's farthest away from them, or, there seems to be no particular reason for choosing the color except, It's just a round. And at this time of age, a lot of what's going on in visual art has to do with fine and gross motor skills both. They're learning both of those at the same time. And so one of the actions you'll see, the way that the child on the left is doing it, is you'll see these windshield wiper marks, because he's learning how that arm moves, and circular marks. So he's learning how the shoulder moves as well as the arm. And then you start seeing smaller versions of that, like smaller circles, smaller lines, and that's the beginning of drawing. When you go to the symbolic stage, which is a very complex stage, lots of movement between the ages in this group, in this age group. There are just so many things going on. I'll show you some examples. Let's talk about the early symbolic stage for the moment. You have floating space, color determined by preference. Now kids are starting to decide what colors they like. And by the way, most people in the West like red and blue the best. And that has to do with that has to do with the eye science that Scott talked about a while ago. Our least favorite colors, chartreuse and yellow-orange. Okay, and so floating space, color determined by preference, and tadpole figures. So here we go, floating space. This is actually a great example of floating space, and some other issues I'm going to talk about in a minute or two. The early development of schema. We'll go back to that. It's color determined by preference. This happens a lot during this early symbolic stage, and even the middle symbolic stage, where you see more than one sun. Because kids are starting to understand that drawing can not only tell a story, which is really foremost in their mind at this point, but it can also be used to decorate and fill the page and influence other things in the page. They start understanding, oh, there's a composition that can be made. And later on, people will be teaching them, fill the page, meaning use all the space. Our teachers never tell people to fill a page, by the way. I've only ever heard a parent say that. Our teachers talk about composing the space rather than just filling the page. But this idea of three suns, for example, that's a pretty common thing you see at this age group. It's not saying that they think we're on another planet. This isn't a sci-fi image.
I think it's further proof that children are aliens.
But it is proof that they do have color preferences at this stage. And these are what's called tadpole figures, and these are critically important in children's development. We want to see kids develop these tadpole figures. They're universal. Every child who has drawing materials around this age in the world who can see and use a drawing implement should be making, they usually do make these, and if they don't, there might be an issue. They will usually draw a circle with two lines coming down and some facial features. Sometimes in some countries, the circle might be slightly different. For instance, there was a big study done in Egypt, and the students at that time, I haven't seen a recent study in Egypt, were drawing rectangles with lines coming down. So there was quite a flurry of investigation to try to figure out why that was. Kids do copy from each other a lot, and so that copying does influence children's drawings. There was a study done quite a while ago now, probably 30 years ago, something like that, of children's drawings in caves. And they knew it was children's drawings because the drawings were more representational higher up, and as you got lower and lower, as the kids got shorter and shorter, the drawings look more and more like drawings now that kids make. And they found some tadpole figures. But you could see the drawings as the children got older being influenced by other people's drawings in the cave. So this aspect of drawing is pretty universal and brain-based. So you'll see these tadpole figures may have some changes. Okay, so this is what I was talking about earlier. This is a schema. It's a schema just in the same way that a letter is a schema in our brain. So why can we look at 10 different A's and know it's an A? Because we have a schematic memory for this symbol, so that if it has these schematic parts, we can say, oh, that's an A. It doesn't matter whether, Mike wrote it, Scott wrote it, or I wrote it. We can recognize each other's A's. The same thing with these tadpole figures. This is the beginning of schematic drawing. So we can look at these and know it's a figure. And then when they start making slight changes to these to show different people, for example, like on the bottom. Sometimes you'll also see 4 lines coming down, that's my dog or cat. All right, so the way that these figures develop is like this. You start out with scribbling, then you go to these sort of circles and marks, go to tadpole figures, do transitional markings, so genitals, for example, become really important at some point, or belly buttons, and then you see a more conventional body with torso. The middle symbolic stage is where another lot of very interesting things happen. So for instance, you get baselines, fold over, X-ray, generic color. So now you use the green, crayon labeled green, and you have the schematic figures and symbols are pretty fully developed. So you get baselines, like this house is firmly planted on a baseline, fold over, which is on the right. You see the people kind of folded over flat. So the child is really trying to tell its story, as I said earlier, and they're doing it in the most efficient way. They're trying to give you the most information that they can give you to get this story across.
Well, the one on the left actually shows, to my eye, some knowledge of perspective even. That's kind of surprising to me that young children can do that.
Yeah, kids are kind of moving toward the academic definition of perspective. Mm-hmm. They're raised, which is in the next stage actually. It's kind of that one's sort of a transitional piece maybe. Because what happens next is they raise the baseline into a plane. And that's what's happening in that room. And by the way, the room in the upper left that has that planar space, a little more sophisticated space than the other rooms, my bet is that's the kid's room. That's I'm betting that's the child's bedroom. Because again, they show you the most important stuff. All right, so now we're talking about a period when students are really very immersed in the schematic arts. Like in this case, you see what I'm talking about with schema? Those hearts look almost exactly alike. They're all a generic red. The flowers all, again, look almost exactly alike. Clouds look almost exactly alike, and so on. Those are the schema for that particular child. And they'll be making those with slight variations until they move out of that schematic stage, break out completely, hopefully with the help of an art teacher or someone who can guide them as they increasingly desire to draw representationally. And that's often what moves children forward from the schematic stage. The one on the right is a guy who's painting his skateboard because he got told by a policeman to get off the street, and he's painting a comic on his skateboard so that the next time he's told to get off the street, he can show it to the police and explain that it's safer for him to be on the street because he can be aware of where cars are rather than skating on the sidewalk where he could run into someone accidentally. So he's more willing to get hurt himself than hurt someone else. So here are just some more schematic figures and symbols. You can see those butterflies, those houses, very schematic, the lollipop trees.
With the correct colors too, brown and green, yeah.
Generic colors, yeah. All right, so late symbolic stage, here's where we have what Scott was mentioning, planar space, overlapping, and above is behind. The kids are, they haven't learned academic perspective yet, but they're moving in that direction by understanding, working hard to find out how to represent three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. Increasingly realistic colors and detailed figures, and including sex differences, for example. So here we have good overlapping. There's that plane moving up on the page, and now the sky is reaching it. We have increasingly realistic color. So students are starting to blend colors now. Sometimes they'll mix their crayon colors even. And we see detail in figures, much more detail in figures. So they've moved beyond the schematic stage now, and they're trying to show us information about individuals. It's a lot of great, look at the flowers here, for instance, and the trees compared to the flowers we saw in the previous stage. And then we get to the older students, the students who are, late elementary, junior high school, and that's when we teach perspective. And here's the reason we don't teach perspective until junior high school. Usually about 7th grade is when we teach perspective. When I was teaching in K-12 art, I taught elementary school art for a while, I had a classroom teacher. I was on a cart. I went around to different classes on a cart. I had an elementary school teacher who said, "Oh, Carrie, I think you're a great art teacher, but I noticed that none of my kids are drawing necks. I really want them to draw necks." And I said, "Well, it's not really the time. It's not really their time to draw necks." And she said, No, I really want them to draw necks." I tried to explain there is such a thing as drawing readiness, like reading readiness, but she told me what she wanted. So the next time I came in, I brought mirrors, and we did a lesson on necks, and we looked at our necks, and we touched our necks and looked at each other's necks and so on. And every drawing in the class had a neck. And she came to me and said, "You're just like the most brilliant art teacher in the world. How did you do that in one hour? That's amazing." And I said, "Thanks, but let's just see what happens next week." So I came back the next week. We did another lesson having to do with figures. I think it was me and my friends on the playground or something like that. Kids all finished the project. Not a neck in the place. Not a neck, because it wasn't important to the story. And the teacher came to me afterwards and said, "Okay, I get it. Yeah, it's like reading readiness." Yeah. Okay, so then we generally speaking wait for perspective until about 7th grade approximately, and also attention to value and shading, and we also see mood, action, humor, and violence as well emerge during this period. So we can teach perspective, and students can get that, the forward is larger and the back is smaller. I'm clicking, but it's not moving forward. Why is that?
Maybe the AV team can advance it?
There we go. We also see attention to value and shading, and kids start doing shock value things then as well, like the spider, which is really cool. Oh. And we also see mood start appear in, either going beyond just telling the story and trying to tell, interesting characteristics of the story, or shifting from the story per se and showing us an image that is really about action or something beyond the story.
I don't think I could draw a picture as good as the one on the left there.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
If I taught you, you could.
Yeah.
So here are just a couple of examples of that. Okay. So the brain research is getting really fascinating. Art education is, half art, half social science. That's one of the reasons I got into art ed, is because I started getting interested in the science. So I hope everyone will pay close attention to their kids getting art materials.
That was great. I got a question for you, Carrie.
Okay.
Do you know of any research that ties the development of skills with depicting geometry and perspective and lines and circles with the corresponding brain ability? Our brains have circuits for detecting edges and straight lines and horizontal and vertical. Is there any studies that you know of that tie physical brain development for visual perception to the depiction that kids make?
I'm not dragging one out, just a specific study out from my memory at the moment, but there certainly is interest in that and the studies of that. That's partly why guessing. I mean, you know, the intention is always, it's always a question when it comes to brain development, but that's one of the advantages or the opportunities that brain development gives us. You know, we're hardwired to be able to draw, to be able to represent. And in the visual arts, that representation, of course, is tied to our visual perception. So many systems work together in the visual arts.
Okay.
And looking for edges, looking for contrast, those are part of that process. That idea of people drawing on the right side of their brain, that's just old, bad science.
Okay.
It's not really real, because actually when kids are making art, lots of different systems light up, including, for instance, the reward system, which I talked about earlier.
And one final question that I thought of, you talk about the desire to make art as being innate. I wonder, are there any animal studies that show that, you know, animals with what we would call higher intelligence have a similar talent for expressing themselves artistically? Maybe not with crayons, but...
Yeah, actually, there is some work with chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys.
Okay.
Where they're able to use crayons, but I believe, I'm not sure about new studies on this, but I believe they're in the scribbling stage.
Okay.
They stay in that first manipulative stage.
We have a question.
I've never read one where they've gotten to the symbolic stage yet.
And you'll have to repeat the question so it can be heard on the video.
Okay.
Carrie, you showed a drawing, a perspective, street and buildings along it, with a very defined vanishing point and perspective very well presented. Do children figure that out, or are they taught that?
No, the question was, do children figure out academic perspective, or do they have to be taught it? And the answer is they have to be taught it. It took Albert Dürer, one of the famous artists who actually figured out academic perspective, decades of his life to figure it out mathematically.
The notion of the vanishing point.
Yeah.
And all, yeah.
Yeah. So yes, that's why we wait to teach it until kids are ready for that. Yeah. Go ahead.
In language learning, I believe it's been found that when little kids learn more than one language when they're young at certain stages, like even toddlers and preschoolers, that then it's easier for them to learn other languages as they go on. Not so for people who are just single language. Is there an analogy or a parallel with art learners? In other words, is there an optimum time to move ahead? And if people like me don't move ahead, does it mean that we will forever have a harder time learning if we try to begin?
I don't know of any research on that.
You wanna
but
ask the question?
general, oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, if someone stops drawing or making art at that kind of middle school level that I was talking about, when art stops being required in school, is it harder as an adult to learn how to draw, for example? And there is some research on that, but the difficulty is that there are a lot of conditions that influence that. It's hard to pin it down exactly. But just my experience tells me that, yes, it is a little bit harder for an adult to learn how to draw than a child. A child has still got a flexible brain, and we hope that adults will always be doing things to keep their brains flexible, obviously. So it really has to do with what else the person has done in between. Like, let's say they're crazy about art. They look at art, they go to museums, they've seen a lot of art, they study art, but they just haven't drawn. Well, then my bet is it's probably going to be easier for them because they will have already studied some aspects of what they would need to know. And it would just be a matter of training their hand-eye coordination and so on to get it on the page.
There's hope.
Yeah.
Adults can learn to do better, more realistic, whatever your preference
Sure.
is, better art,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
They can learn how to make realistic art. Yeah, but it takes work. Yeah, I guess maybe the lesson from the research says it takes more time and effort the farther you get away from it.
What's the famous woman, I'm blanking on her name right now, who started painting at 80?
Yeah,
Grandma Rosa?
yeah.
Grandma Moses? Maybe.
Yeah, the comment from the audience was there's a famous artist who did not start painting apparently until her 80s. That was Grandma Moses, right?
Yeah, and people in the visual arts would say that one of the appeals of her work was that it wasn't highly representational. It was folk art, and so it was actually kind of that one of those later stages I talked about. That wasn't her purpose. She wasn't working toward realism.
And a question occurred to me as you were describing that. What about three-dimensional art? Sculpting or architecture or something like that. How does that fit in?
Yeah, they can hear that, right?
Yeah, I've got a microphone.
So three-dimensional art requires a different set of studies, and those have been done. But what's really interesting, and I actually did a study on the same thing with computer graphics years and years ago. And one thing that's very interesting is that the medium does have an impact. That when you start working with clay for the first time, or when you start working with a drawing program or a painting program on your computer, you will go through a scribbling stage. When I actually did this study with some undergraduates some years ago with a painting program, they had never used a painting program, so I gave them a painting program, taught them how to use it, and the very first day they were just all going like this, like that, and using their arm to try to figure out how to use the materials. And then, but very quickly, they moved on to being able to represent. So we do have to go through that beginning stage. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take.
Great.
Yeah.
No matter the medium. Yeah.
Right.
So when they start with clay, they
Each
just
new
make
medium,
blobs.
Yeah, each new medium you have to let people go through that moment where they find out what the characteristics of the medium are, and that's sort of what the very young children are doing. They're trying to understand for the first time what mark making means, that you can actually use this crayon or this marker on the wall, this permanent black marker on the wall, and that this is what happens when you do. And they're also learning the medium of the body, right? So they're learning how to use the body in that particular way, and they find out really quickly what happens when they use the
And they're
black
turned
dry
off for
marker.
art forever after that. Yeah.
Hopefully not. Usually if they're that excited and interested, they'll keep going, hopefully.
Well, thank you. That was really great.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I felt like we could go on with questions and thoughts about that for quite some time. I hope to have you back to talk about other aspects of it too, Carrie. It's very, very helpful elucidating. I gotta admit that I was one of the art-phobic students that probably didn't have a teacher like Carrie or didn't take advantage of the teachers that I had. I think that you talked about how it can release dopamine in children. I think in my case, it released cortisol, the stress-reducing agents. I actually was involved with the Waldorf School. It's out here in the western suburbs, and very art-based type of education. And as a member of the school, as the adults, we could come in and do some art projects. And I was like, I'm not sure if I'm going to go that night to that. But I showed up, and we were doing things with leaves and everything, and I could just feel the stress building immensely in me. It's not I'm back at the tadpole stage, maybe symbolically or something too, and it's a challenge.
I want to say what I'm going to say. That's because with some kids, the stress level of having your work seen overtakes the creation process.
Okay.
That's what's unique about art, not like math, science, and social, all the other schoolwork. People see it.
Right.
You want to
Carrie's
repeat?
saying that just the presentation of it, just it being there, put on board, and I remember being very, very concerned when teachers were putting, all the artwork got put on the board, and, when it was the time for mine, I knew everybody was looking at me and my artwork, and
So it's the public performance aspect of it that can contribute to the anxiety, social
Right.
anxiety.
Yeah. No, I was wondering too if having older siblings, that maybe their artwork is further along, and I know I was judging my artwork and not saying it was good enough, you know. When it was time to carve pumpkins, my sister, older than me, carved much better pumpkins, you know, than I did. We'd each get a piece of paper and draw what we wanted to do, and obviously there was no question, you know, that in my mind I knew that my sister's artwork was better and that should be on the pumpkin. And I think my parents would try to say, well, let's talk, let's incorporate elements of both and everything. And I was just like saying, no, you're just humoring me now.
You know,
so
Mike-
the cortisol can really get flowing in me, I guess.
We've known each other for more than a decade, and I never knew that you had a pumpkin phobia previously.
Yeah. Well, fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And like I say, I hope you can come back and spread some more talk about this. It'd be very, very fun. I remember hearing when Carrie's dad, Art Friedman, would talk about water issues and present at Science Sundays for me too, and how well he broached the subject and talked about things and made it all understandable to us. So he's been kind of a mentor or an ideal for me in that way, how he could take very complex topics and bring them down to a understandable level. So that's kind of the goal of what I do at Science Sunday, and so that's very nice. Thanks. I know I'm not going to get to all the things I wanted to talk about today, but I think it was beautiful the time we spent talking about the issue. I've been reading a book called 1,000 Days of Wonder, and it's actually a scientist's chronicle of his daughter's developing mind. So with his wife's acceptance, and I think she's a psychologist as well, they took their young child who was being born and raised up and living, and they did all the psychological experiments they wanted to on her because they could, because they were her parents. So he wrote a book about it, videotaped her doing all these things. So just like Carrie's talking about the stages of artistic development, he's talking about the stages of his daughter's intellectual development as well too. And one thing I think I talked about a little bit trying to set this up for last week, I was thinking of mental images that describe maybe how a brain develops in a young child. Most of my talk today, and I'll probably have to bleed over into another Science Sunday, talks about development of the brain in young children, maybe even before they're born, what's going on. But one is to imagine a flower unfolding from a bud slowly. And I actually had a time-lapse photo, maybe you've seen them too, they're pretty amazing to watch. And I woke up this morning and everything I had on the computer had been lost overnight. So
Oh, no.
This is all recreated. So I didn't bother to put the time-lapse photography in. But if you imagine a small bud of a rose growing out into be the full, beautiful rose as it is, and the development of that. Sometimes people talk about that. That's how the budding mind develops, and that's kind of a mental image we have. And I know Carrie and I talked about a little bit of that 2 weeks ago when I was talking about this. And the other mental image is a developing city, or the growth of a city as it gets larger, has more people come in, more responsibilities, more duties. And a city grows like that too, and you can also get time-lapse photos of the growth of, like, Dubai is a pretty impressive one. They're building these islands out in the water and everything like that, and the skyscrapers are going up and different things are happening. You know, and those are another way to look at what's occurring in a mind too. And probably my point is that one of these is maybe not so accurate and not too helpful, and the other one is a little bit more accurate. So today we're discussing about what science knows about the development of the brain, and maybe I'll spill the beans and say which I think is the more accurate, which science tends to think is a more accurate depiction of the growth of the brain, and maybe you'll come up with your concepts of it as well too. But really, a brain doesn't just spring up miraculously into existence on the day its owner happens to take its first breath. You know, Aristotle talked about it, and John Locke talked about it. A lot of the scientific thoughts about development of the brain was that tabula rasa, the blank page, the blank slate, right? And not just the first day. Here's a picture of a baby 1 week after birth. And it isn't that at this time it takes its first breath now that it starts brain development. The brain has been doing a lot of miraculous things, and actually with a lot of studies and ways of getting inside literally the womb and evaluating what's going on, there's a lot known about the development of the brain, what goes on with that. So Aristotle and John Locke called it tabula rasa and only investigated what children really learned after birth. And that was done for decades and centuries after that time. It's not so much a well-known, it wasn't so much of an emphasized aspect of it. It was, now the child is born, it's taken its breath, it's ready to learn about the world. So that's generally significantly changed now. People are seeing what's going on in utero, and even, you can even say before the utero, the conceptions and the ideas that a parent forms about a child that's going to be born are passed to that child in some ways, just what's happening there. So it's interesting to say, what have we learned and what's going on? And this is one thing that this author, the scientist, said about it. You can go further back than just conception. You might remember your own mother, as being cool and aloof, or providing contradictory and frightening signals about how someone should behave. Or more happily, you might recall your own mother as being emotionally available, loving, and supportive. Studies have shown that if you recall having had a secure emotional relationship with your own mother, it is highly likely that your child will have a similar relationship with you. Although we are still some way from explaining precisely how these patterns of love and possibly mistrust cycle across the generations, it seems to have something to do with how parents-to-be conceive of their fetus in progress. In one study, psychologists simply invited mothers and fathers in the third trimester of pregnancy, before the child was born, to describe how they thought their baby would turn out at 6 months of age. Predict what your baby will do, what will go on, how will that be? The researchers really weren't that interested in whether the predictions were accurate or not, or even whether they were made at all. Talking about your prenate as a real person long before you have made its physical acquaintance suggests that you have already started to take that person seriously. As predicated, parents who gave richer projections of their baby's personalities were more likely, when observed as in interaction with them at 6 months, to treat their infants as independent beings with minds of their own. So that's a little bit, think again about a bud of a flower growing as compared to a city developing, and see which one seems to be what psychologists are saying more happens with the mind when you hear that. So, another means of fostering neonatal brain development is surely to be auditory. Some tests have revealed the sonic pressure inside the womb can hit 95 decibels, which is the sound of a plane taking off at O'Hare. So children in utero are hearing sounds, hearing things going on, the singing to a child, or the telling them that you love them, repeating their name or ideas to them over and over and over is surely coming in some way to them. Experiments have shown that fetuses learn the sound of their mother's voice and can distinguish it from a stranger's moments after birth. They also did some studies where parents were put into two groups. The families that watched Friends on TV show for quite a while. The study's a little bit dated, but watched the Friends show on TV and heard that regularly, as compared to another group was parents who had not watched the Friends show. And actually they found that the children of people that had watched Friends regularly knew the theme song and were more able to comprehend that theme song.
Dance to it a little.
Right, dance.
Yeah.
After birth, they were able to more. Now you ask, how can they do that? How do you measure that?
How can they do that?
Now you may ask that, and may you ask. And a lot of that is some levels of interest that they see sparked in a child. A child will respond to things that have some level of impact, that have had some level of impact on them in the past. So they were able to see marked levels, much higher levels of interest, the child turning and paying attention to the song when it was played, if they had heard it in utero many times, as compared to children that hadn't heard it in utero and the song was played and it had no real impact on them at all. So that's a pretty interesting aspect of what teaching and learning is going on. Inside utero, kids are forming some level of memories.
So you could use that to program your baby to enjoy Metallica or Elton John. Or,
Right.
Yeah.
And probably do that, right? So what's going on in utero? Really, if you think about brain development, if you could observe the brain under a powerful microscope, you would see new nerve cells in babies being formed at rates of up to 10,000 neurons a second.
Is that neurons or synapses? 10,000.
They actually are calling them at that time neurites, and they're the beginnings of things that are going to form into the dendrites and axons.
Huh.
So it's the beginning development of the neural cells. Neural cells are growing.
Okay.
And I've seen different numbers at different times. They talk about 10,000 a second. Another book I heard 700 a second. I'm sure it's different times, different things are occurring. But phenomenal amount of brain growth going on. Of the 100 billion neurons that make up the adult brain, most would have already been manufactured by the second trimester in the womb. That's a bit misleading, though, for at least two reasons. One, really, many are immature. They're just the beginnings of these things. They're forming neural cells, but they aren't mature. They're not capable of fulfilling the most basic function of a nerve cell yet. Second, up to half of the cells produced in these weeks are destined for an early death. Now, why would so many neural cells be formed and then so many die off so regularly, so at such a preponderant level?
Oh, I have an idea.
Do you?
Yeah,
I thought
do.
you might.
Yeah. Yeah, I have read I haven't read that particular book, but I've read similar accounts of neural pruning.
Neural pruning is the term, right?
Yeah, and to me, I came up with this analogy the other day of filling a chalkboard with chalk, just absolutely covering it, back to Carrie's presentation. And then, that opens up the possibility that chalk could be etched away to leave any kind of figure. It could be alphabet, it could be artistic depiction of something. And so in this analogy, your brain prepares for whatever may come just by making anything possible. And through learning and subsequent development, you erase the negative spaces, right? You etch away the things that are not reinforced.
It's called neural pruning very often. Another term is neural commitment, which is a more positive feature. Neural commitment means that if there is some action that's going on that uses those cells, those connections, those neural connections, that'll be fostered and developed and built up stronger. So neural commitment to certain passageways through the brain are fostered, and also neural pruning. And one good example, I think that's a great analogy. Another good example is language development. I think in the Russian language, there's two words that to us sound exactly alike, and one is for the letter blue, and the other is for the letter for, and they spell them slightly differently. They pronounce them slightly differently. Westerners, we can't hear a difference at all. We can't tell a difference at all.
So it's not like your and your, where it's the same sound meaning different things.
Well, I mean, that could be, to us it sounds the same, but some people might say your and your or something, they might say it slightly
But
different.
a native Russian speaker will actually hear the words differently, right? Okay.
Right. And so what occurred in case like the neural pruning, those synapses were there enabling a child to be able to distinguish between those. In the Slavic communities and Slavic even in the United States. Slavic communities that speak a lot of Russian, their children will be able to differentiate that difference. And Americans who hear this word, to them, they don't hear any words that even sound like that. They're spelled like with an I and a Y to distinguish the difference. So basically, that's an understanding of neural commitment and how so much of these brain cells that are there don't get fostered, don't get nurtured, and it's a use it or lose it kind of prospect.
It reminds me of the Navajo code talkers the sounds that they made with their language could not be easily distinguished, and so it was impossible to interpret.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I think also in the Slavic language, generally, many longer syllable words are emphasized. The emphasis goes on the first syllable. In American, in English, much of the emphasis on longer syllable words goes on the second syllable. So as we talk to babies, they start hearing this emphasis on the second syllable, and they're able to distinguish words in one pattern and learn that the emphasis is often on the second syllable, and in the Slavic languages are learning exactly the opposite, right? But so the neurons that have made appropriate connections are nurtured and remain. Others really basically shrivel and die off. Brain development at this stage is really as much about the decimation of multitudes of neural cells as it is about the phenomenal reproduction rate, too. Okay. So, how does neural growth go about? I wanted to talk a little bit about the brain architecture, and that may be as far as we're able to get today, but we'll go on, I think, in a month from now. From only 2 to 4 months after conception, neuron formation moves rapidly from a neural tube out along networks of pathways laid down by structural cells that you can see here called glia. So, columns of neurons, 500,000 in number, each contain around 60,000 neurons. Now that they're in place, these glia are in place, they can go about the business of connecting to other neurons. Neurites, which are preliminary structures that become dendrites and axons, the nerve cells that we know, neurites turn into axons or dendrites. They generally follow a chemical trail, so things can be left there that travel a path that cause these dendrites and axons to follow paths to go. It's often laid by the target cells themselves. So much of what happens is a result, really, of local conditions. A dendrite may move a certain way to reach out in there because of the chemicals that it senses in the brain. Again, think of this now, if you can, back to the rows in the city and see if that kind of leads towards one or the other as being a means of understanding the budding, the growth of the brain. But stimulation from elsewhere in the nervous system is really necessary to get neurons embedded in working relationships with each other. Those that don't find a role, they die off. Two important things start to occur in utero, but really take off after birth. One is the maturation of neurites into dendrites and axons, forming a functioning nerve cell. And the second is myelination. And we'll talk about that a bit too, what those things are. Some other, just a little getting closer and closer at some of the cells here. These are all nerve cells, and nerve cells are interesting cells. They have a nucleus, and they grow like other cells as well too. They can die off and so on. But they also can be long. Some nerve cells, I think, can be as much as 6 feet long, twisting and turning their way around. And this is what occurs when one nerve cell makes a connection with another. There's actually a gap in between it. You can see a synaptic cleft, they call it, or a synapse. And on top is one nerve cell that's ending up, and it's meeting up with the other end of another nerve cell. And the things that are occurring in here are just phenomenal when you look at these things. There's tiny little, I'm not that knowledgeable or concerned about the actual chemistry of it, but actually there's these synaptic vesicles that hold tiny little neurotransmitters. And when that nerve cell is activated, the top one, the nerve impulse comes down there and it creates a pathway. The vesicles go out to the end of that nerve cell and actually are deposited, get released, and they cross that gap. So every time there's a nervous thing that happens in your body, it's actually a chemical reaction is occurring. The only way nerves can connect with each other is through a chemical process.
Yeah, they shuttle little chemicals back and forth.
Neurotransmitters go across, they're picked up by the next one, and then the message is passed to the next nerve cell. This is actually an actual scanning electron microscope picture that's been stained to show these vesicles, but it's the axon terminal, the end of the first nerve cell, and that top part of it has been broken open, and it reveals these synaptic vesicles, blue and orange stained so that you can see them better inside the neuron. So these things are just phenomenally there, ready to activate. Every time you do anything, your nerves activate are activating your muscles, your musculature. These things are firing, and these vesicles are released and go across the line onto the next nerve. So, pretty phenomenal issue. Let's see if this is a myelin sheath, the other thing I talked about. And you can see that's actually, from some of the things, there's a lot of questions about it, but you can see it's a protective sheath, which actually acts like an insulator, and it speeds up the action of the nerve cells. And that was actually, they've seen evidence of that in all vertebrae, going all the way back to even the jawed fish. But the non-jawed fish don't have this in their system. And so the aspect that they think is at the time that jawed fish started evolving, there was a retrovirus, a virus that came in that actually was this myelin, and this myelin has been incorporated into all vertebrates because it's a benefit. So it's some aspect of a retrovirus, something that's not endemic to an animal, coming into that system, into that animal, and being utilized, sort of like mitochondria and different things have been used in the cell structure. This is another way that myelin has been incorporated into all vertebrates to make our actions much quicker, much more responsive to nervous input. Right? So that's a pretty fascinating thing. You could have a Science Sunday talk just about just myelin and nerve cells and so on too. So myelin is really a fatty substance which forms an insulating sheath around the axon. Myelination leads to really significant improvements in speed and efficiency of communicating along the nerves. That's something that's not there in young children and in pre-infants. Myelination occurs over time. This maturing of the brain continues into the mid-20s, actually. So we talked about neural pruning or neural commitment a little bit there, and I thought that's an important topic to come out with today. And we talked about how that can show up in rhythms and syntax, language, and so on, and have some important benefits to our brains being focused in on what makes things that we need work, right? And how different brains can come and have different capacities. Okay. So I wanted 3 takeaways to come out of this, and this is something that we can continue on from a little bit too, possibly. One is that it's really important to realize that experiences build the brain architecture. How a brain functions, how a brain grows, how a brain develops, is very much dependent upon the fact that the things that occur to that brain cause the brain to respond in ways and grow and develop along a certain path. So that's somewhat, if you'd have anyone in the audience have an idea about the growth of a city or the growth of a rose, which you think is more emblematic of a brain cell developing. Beth, do you have some ideas?
I just saw a very brief squib in the newspaper having to do with the growth of the amygdala.
Yeah, amygdala?
That grew more rapidly in infants who had autism.
Oh, really?
And I thought to myself, I wonder whether there would be scientists now looking at the possibility of slowing that down
Uh-huh.
in order to better serve the youngster who might be really handicapped with autism.
Beth is saying that she read something in the paper that seems to be an initial study that indicates that maybe children with autism have their amygdala growing faster than normal. And she's wondering if there may be some ways that science can affect and do that. I'm sure it's being evaluated and studied, right? Any comments about the rose or the city? What is the brain more like? Or are you avoiding that? What would you say, Stephanie?
Well, I began appreciating the rose analogy, remembering how I've seen buds tremble and blossom open. But I think, given your latest discussion, the city growing appeals more. So, I don't know.
She originally liked ideas of the rose budding into fruit of something that it's intended to be, and then some of the talk today got her thinking the city was more alike in some of the ways I've talked about things too. I'd have to say that, yeah, my inclination is that the city, the development, a city responds to needs and challenges and so on. If everyone wants a swimming pool, maybe they'll build a swimming pool. If they need skyscrapers, they'll build that, or parking lots, or beaches, or whatever, if they need more police stations or schools. Whereas a rose is pretty much controlled by its biology, right? Its biology tells it to grow into this and do that. It can be affected by the environment,
Right.
but it doesn't respond and change its growth pattern, its blossoming pattern, and so on, except maybe over long evolutionary times, right? So, yeah. So this is, again, experiences are critical in building brain architecture, just as the experiences what a city goes through have a big impact on how a city will grow, what will go on with that. The second big takeaway is serve and return interactions shape brain circuitry. So when you think of a serve and return, you're thinking of tennis, and one is serving and the other's returning. If you think of who's serving, that it might be counterintuitive, but in child development, really, the child is doing the serving. They're babbling, they're drawing odd things, they're doing things that are a reach out. They're very well acclimated to how to get attention back, right? If it's evolved to get attention back, because otherwise they might starve, emotionally or physically. So everything that a child does is a serve to a parent or to someone that's a caretaker. And the return that comes back is what you do. And if you can look at it that way, they served me this and I returned it, and they served and I returned. They say a jumble of words and you repeat it back. But you repeat it back maybe with your emphasis in your way. And the things that you're saying and the way that you're saying the things that you do cause the child to maybe alter a little bit of their brain circuitry. They heard you say something, they said something to you that maybe had accents in a funny place or emphasis on odd ways. But when you change it back, you're changing that back into a little bit more maybe of an imitation of English to them or their language that they want.
I've heard that baby talk, go ooh, coo, 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 whatever adults do, is universal. Every culture does it, from every language background. So it must be an intrinsic part of the development of communication and language and brains to a certain extent.
Anything that's done as a parent or a caregiver to a child is this, if it's looked at as a return of their serve, that you can then model and bring in behavior, and that affects how their brain develops. You're showing them that, first of all, that just talking back and forth, that communication is important, right? When they say something and you respond, then they respond back with another statement too.
And have you noticed that baby talk is typically high-pitched as well? So there are universal characteristics that seem to be related to the biology of the brain and the way we express ourselves and the way we train a developing brain.
Now, this goes against maybe what was thought 50, 100 years ago, in which you're let the child cry things out, let the child, don't respond to a child all the time, show them when they should be open and show them when they should be quiet and so on too. But so much goes on that really talks about the fact that any way that you're returning whatever is served to you by the baby is going to help them develop. Probably in art as well. You have to talk to them at their level, and maybe you adjust a little something back in the artwork that's going their way, and then it goes on from there.
In the discussions of artistic development, so how many decades ago was this? I don't remember, 3 decades ago, maybe something like that. There was a lot of discussion about the flower metaphor and how inappropriate that was.
Really?
And even though we're hardwired to do a lot of the things that I was talking about, education plays a role. If it didn't, then we wouldn't see those differences occur when they occur.
Right. So Carrie's saying that it was actually a metaphor that had been discussed in educational circles to not think about kids in that way of development of the brain. And it's better to think of it
in the flower way, right?
In the flower way, right. Not think of that rose and budding out to become whatever it's intended to be. It's more that we have an impact on them, again, like how a city might develop. And the final one, the final takeaway, if you can remember serve and return if you're interacting with a baby, toxic stress derails healthy brain development. And maybe this is a toxic stress I was talking about the artwork or the response to my artwork I was getting. And there is that hormone called cortisol, right? And cortisol is produced by stress. When you face stress quite often, your body produces it. Now, it's not always bad. It activates you. A little bit of stress, maybe even in your artwork, a little challenge of how to make perspective right or how to represent my parents to my friends or to myself. A little bit of stress, a little bit of cortisol activates you and focuses you on what you want to do, but repeated toxic overuse of stress causes deleterious effects. It can be debilitating, actually, and that was my art teacher, Ms. Cortisol, I think.
I had that in math class. I had a horrible math teacher.
Toxic stress actually kills cells in the hippocampus, is what they're finding now too, which are the things that can be important in just mood creation and mood regulation and so on. And which reminds me of one final thing, the talk we had by Robert a few years ago about ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and the fact that the things that occur in your life can affect your heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and a lot of different actions and so on too. So it's a little bit of an overview. I think I am really happy of what Carrie brought today about the artwork and how that develops in people. I would need a remedial course, I would be sure, and be able to come back and actually draw art. I think I'm still at the tadpole stage personally. So Thanks so much for coming to Science Sunday. We appreciate the AV people up top, Mike Els and Carrie, Dr. Carrie Friedman for coming in and talking, and the visitors in the audience too. Thank you so much. Any questions?
We'll be back in 2 weeks. I want to have just a discussion with you and whoever shows up in our audience about why science education is important in general and why it's important to us to be science communicators. So, see how that goes.
All right, we might want to have a microphone to pass around or something too, right?
Yeah.
People could ask their questions more cohesively. Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks again up there, and have a great April.